The light's not on, is it? Oh, there it is. Oh, that's much more beneficial. Sorry, guys. Okay, and here's just a general map. So we have fully legalized, and then we have favorable, mostly unfavorable, and then very unfavorable. As you can see, we have China being the very unfavorable, and then USA is favorable, and then a lot of Europe is pretty favorable. But on the whole, I mean, from my perspective, the regulatory kind of development over time is that there have been hiccups in terms of Mt. Gox, Silk Road, and I mean, I'm sure a ton of other examples that aren't in the mainstream media. But realistically, it is progressing towards an area where they're just starting to understand it more and more. And I think from a regulatory perspective, that's giving them more and more insight into how they're going to develop a regulatory framework. And the one thing I will say about the United States is that while initially they were simply trying to layer traditional regulatory frameworks into blockchain and cryptos, I think that they're open to developing a new system that has some of that incorporated into it, but is somewhat really geared towards the technology. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of the balance. They're trying not to stifle the technology, but also not trying to let everyone just enjoy the wild, wild west and buy everything on Silk Road. All right, initial coin offerings. So if anybody doesn't know, an initial coin offering is a means of an investment opportunity for anybody who essentially has access to a blockchain platform, the most popular one being the Ethereum platform. And a couple other ones are Waves, NEM, these platforms where you can essentially launch a decentralized application or a blockchain-based business or something like that, and you tie your own token to it, and then you distribute it in exchange for whatever token is on the platform that you're on. In the Ethereum context, it's the Ether token. So obviously we've seen some pretty substantial ICOs, namely of which are Filecoin, Tezos, and EOS. Lots and lots of money raised. 2016, more than 100 million raised through ICOs globally. And then 2017, the volume exceeded 3 billion. So from my perspective, it's a lot of money, and it's growing pretty exponentially. And one way of kind of tracking ICO, there's a couple different ICO sites out there, and they couple it all together, and they'll give you the larger numbers and what the market caps are and everything like that. But one thing that I always try to pay attention to is that they rank the GDP of every country, and Bitcoin is actually on that ranking now, and it slowly, incrementally goes up every couple weeks or months. So the 2018 prediction, while it's going to vary greatly, but the market is anticipated to continue to increase. And then from my perspective, I think that while there is regulatory pressure, that countries will start kind of falling by the wayside in terms of what they actually feel about the regulatory perspective. Do they want to really kind of harp down on it, or do they want to at least let the technology develop and kind of grow into what it's meant to be, which is an arduous definition. But all right, so I think one of the largest aspects of ICOs, and there's a huge debate, and I'm going to focus on the legal aspects of it in the United States, but it's this security versus utility component. And what I mean by that is, what is the utility of the token? Like, how is it used on the actual platform, right? So for those of you who don't know, on the Ethereum network, transacting using the Ether token, so if you want to just use the network, right? Like, there's some component to being able to develop your software platform on the Ethereum platform. And so there's something tied to it. It's not simply a means of investment. Now, there's a store of value component to it, obviously, because it's worth money, but there's some differentiation in terms of that and what a traditional security is. And so we've had a couple different examples, and I do want to point out that it's still very nascent. Like, there is not a lot of information that the SEC has provided in terms of how clearly your ICO, if you were to launch one, is going to go through this path. And it's not going to be segmented either way. And anybody who tells you that your token is fully a utility token and it's not a security, that's just incorrect, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And the SEC could easily categorize any utility token as a security. And in fact, they already have. So the DAO, probably the most popular ICO that was categorized as a security under the SEC's purview was a decentralized autonomous organization. They raised $150 million. So the way that the SEC kind of made their decision is that they applied a traditional test that's from a 1950s Supreme Court case, and it's called the Howey test. And so this is a prime example of them using traditional regulatory frameworks in a newly technological area and having a result. And here are the 4 requirements for the Howey test. And this is what the SEC, they really elaborated in their report about the DAO. And they talked about these 4 factors, one being whether the token holders made an investment money. Oh, but before I read all these 4, you're definitely going to get the feeling that, wait, this is literally every token in existence. That makes sense. So the first one is whether the token holders made an investment of money. Okay. 2, is it in a common enterprise? I mean, almost always. 3, from which they expect to profit. 4, do the efforts of others. So 3, I write this most important component to it because from the SEC's perspective, it really is about the participant in the ICO. And so an individual who sits down at their computer and wants to go through an up-and-coming ICO, and they just want to make sure that they exchange their Ether token, Bitcoin, NEM, Waves, whatever, into whatever the token that's being released, that's where they're really trying to harp in on how are we looking at from their perspective. Are they perceiving this solely as a means to make money? Because realistically, if they are, then there's some issues in regards to whether this is a security. And also,
I'm sorry, do all 4 of those have to be true?
Yes.
All of them?
All of them. If one of these is not true, it is not a security under the traditional regulatory framework with the SEC.
What about fork tokens?
I'm sorry?
Like hard fork tokens? When there's like airdrop or hard fork?
So hard fork, same application.
Okay.
There's a little bit of debate about what airdrops because they're not, like, it depends on whether they're listed on exchanges, which I'll actually get to in a second. But yeah, it's very much a gray area still. But yeah, so harping on this third point is that where's the expectation of profit? And this is really where the DAO went wrong and also where Munchie went wrong. Because Munchie was actually a VC-backed ICO, like very legitimate, and it wasn't a group of hackers like from all over the world just like chiming into this decentralized blockchain-based app or anything like that. It was very, very legit, and they still became a security because they promised investors a return. And they basically said that this token, if you invest in our business, it's going to go up in value in the future. And that is exactly what a security is. So that was kind of like the one thing that I really want to harp on is that if, say, you encounter somebody who's launching an ICO or you're launching an ICO yourself, just make sure that in your white paper, in your Slack, Telegram channel, whatever the communication medium is, there's no language that indicates that there's going to be a future return on this token. Because I know that I said that it's really up in the air and a token could easily be a security. There are current situations where they're not securities. And so one way to increase your chance of not being a security is by making sure you avoid any type of language regarding that.
So that's only because you're actually saying that you can expect profit. I mean, everyone is participating in this wants to make profit.
Right.
But as long as you don't say that, you're okay.
So
you might not be.
So it'll increase your chances of not being a security. You still could easily be a security. And that to that point, like exchange listing, that's why you'll see a lot of developers who are in these channels who are working on the platform or whatever it is, like they'll be like, we're not talking about exchanges. Like we won't mention it at all. And the reason that they're not doing that is because they don't want the SEC to come in and be like, well, you were expecting it to be listed on an exchange. Like there's no reason for anybody to start an ICO and then be like, oh, I'm going to put it on exchange, but it's still utility based. Yeah.
How is that different from an IPO? Like, you know what an IPO goes down?
The difference between an IPO and a utility-based token? Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's not a significant amount of difference. And I think that's one of the general concerns, at least in the space currently, is that there's no clear regulatory path. And so the SEC could kind of come in and pick and choose who they want to make an example of. And yep.
One of two things on that. One, how often is it tracked? Because all these things are pretty new. So within a certain amount of time, is there like a grace period into where someone can actually go for profitability or go for actually like, as a security? And the second point would be, is the SEC then also having certain regulations on themselves or on who they pick and choose besides those standards? Like, is there like a ethical standard or something like that, or does that go to a certain board?
So if I understand your first question correctly, you're asking, is there a grace period in terms of launching
Where
that?
someone can prove themselves to be a
For sure. So it actually just happened, I think like yesterday or the day before, where the SEC went to Overstock.com and a bunch of other large companies that were launching ICOs, and they're like, hey, we want all your information. So they're not coming in and being like, you're a security, or anything like that. Like they're very much give us all the information surrounding that. And Overstock.com, they were pretty optimistic, which is kind of weird. But
Have they talked to Amazon at all, to your knowledge?
no, not that I know of. At least I haven't read anything about it. And also, if Amazon was launching ICO, we'd probably know. But but yeah, so just kind of going back to, is there any other questions? We're good. Going back to the Munchie example, this was, like I said, a very legit, like just a restaurant review blockchain platform. But again, they promised that the token would be listed on exchange. And then this one is actually not an example, but it's a recent legal filing. A group of investors filed a securities violation against an ICO that they participated in, which is interesting. But they basically were never credited their tokens, and it was a mining operation in Washington, and they were assigning the token to be able to mine in the actual facility. You could put your own miners, or they would house miners. They would bring in their own miners for you, stuff like that. And they're suing the founders of Gigawatt in order to claim that they violated securities law and therefore should refund them of their actual money. And I will say that their $20 million invested is like $120 million now, so they missed out on a lot of money, but you know. Anyways, I think that's going to be a future example that we'll see come up, that where the SEC could step in and use the very, very newly formed regulatory framework from the DAO and the Munchie and apply it to that individual instance. All right. Any other questions regarding ICOs? Definitely, yeah.
Why are you screwed if your ICO gets classified as a security?
So if you haven't, it's a great question. If you haven't filed the requisite paperwork and you haven't focused in on specifically accredited investors, and I'll maybe explain what a SAFT is in a second if anybody wants to know. But if you haven't done any of that, then you substantial fines, your business goes under, and 5 years federal prison. So other than that, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. But yeah.
In that case, Filecoin is covered, right? Because
Right.
it was all
Right. And you'll see other ones like Polymath is a really good example where they're trying to launch security compliant ICOs or tokens. And so they've done all the requisite paperwork with the SEC. They've gone through that process. And then they're trying to, there's a debate about whether those coins can be listed on just a general exchange like Bittrex, Binance, Poloniex, whatever. Because if you're trading specifically a security, then it's a different medium and there's a whole different regulatory perspective. And so I definitely foresee a future where there's independent opportunities for investments, one specifically being security trading and the other one being utility-based token trading. And that kind of helps me highlight the notion that I don't think the US regulatory government, so the CFTC and the SEC, are going to come out and be like, no ICOs. Like they're definitely not going to come in and just be like, absolutely not, it's totally done. But they are going to incrementally use these case study examples to build up a framework. Yeah. Any other ICO questions? Yep. Okay.
Is it about the fact that you can trade these tokens, and then does it even make sense to ask a question like, can you make a token that can't be traded, or is that just not a token?
No, yeah, for sure. Right. So there's obviously it's a conundrum. It doesn't make sense, and there are platforms that are trying to keep their token within the actual blockchain-based platform. And so, for example, actually, I had a conversation with a guy I think it was a couple months ago, and he worked for a record label, and the record label wanted to launch a token platform where anybody who signed up could exchange those tokens for merchandise, discount tickets, stuff like that, and it would never be listed, right? But if that token exists, anybody, any exchange could be like, oh yeah, we're going to list that token. I mean, they launched the mainnet and they move forward.
There already are two tokens that do that. One is Current.
Right.
And the other one is Brave. Well, Brave is just
Brave browser, right? Yeah, yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, but they're traded on exchanges.
Brave and what's the other one?
Current, which only works actually on iPhone.
Yeah, right. And Brave has the BAT token, and that's traded on a bunch of exchanges. So,
One other question.
yeah,
The fourth item in the Howey test was
I can go back.
due to the effort of others.
Yeah.
For the DAO, the purpose of that whole thing was that everyone was supposed to vote on how the money got allocated to the
Mhm.
investors. Is that
Right.
Is that the effort of others?
Yeah, so it was the SEC specifically highlighted, well, they addressed each factor, and when they talk about this one, they were talking about the individuals who built the actual decentralized autonomous organization. So it was the facilitation of that groupthink mentality, building that structure. That's where they derived satisfying number 4. And so it's not necessarily that, like, so if everyone's voting, right, to launch that specific ICO, it's the platform itself that allows everyone to launch it that leads to the satisfaction of that factor. Yeah.
So, with regards to whether you're listed on exchanges, to a large extent, that's out of the control of the person creating the token. I mean, specifically on Ethereum, there's now decentralized exchanges. So, if you create an ERC20 token, it can be traded on an exchange.
Right.
You don't get to decide that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, has there been any kind of guidance around that? Like, what does that mean in terms of your token?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. So like EtherDelta is a perfect example of that. Like if someone just wanted to list on, like, it's totally fine. In that case, the SEC looks at whether you were the driving force behind it, and so that's really what differentiates you between some type of liability or culpability, is that they're focusing in on, okay, did you promise investors a listing on an exchange? Did you contact exchanges? I know the CEO of Binance has been offered like millions of dollars by different tokens to list their tokens, stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of like, okay, where do we assign some type of element of responsibility? And that's what they look for when they're evaluating it, for sure. That's a great question. All right, we're going to just briefly talk about exchanges. Am I good on time, Ryan? Am I good? So for an exchange, Giancarlo, when he was talking about the regulatory framework that they want to start approaching, they listed ICOs, they listed exchanges, and then they did blockchain businesses, in that they're going to target ICOs first and foremost. And so a byproduct of that is that we have some regulation about exchanges, but not full-on, like, fledged, hey, this is what you need to do from a compliance perspective. And I ran into this early on, is that I reached out to SEC because I started a hedge fund, and so I was like, okay, how do I layer the traditional hedge fund model into the way that I structure a crypto-based fund? And they're somewhat a little different, but for the most part, it ends up requiring the same amount of regulatory practice. And so as of right now, it's not necessarily that you have to do that, but it's best practices, essentially. And for the exchange component, as we saw with the Coinbase example, it is kind of like, hey, make sure you do your due diligence, make sure you implement best practices, because when we come for that information, you better have some kind of medium that allows us to process it so that we can go after these individuals and make sure that they're paying their taxes, make sure that they're not fraudulently buying guns, stuff like that. So in the exchange context, they're really focusing on anti-money laundering and know your client. And the know your client is a really it's a big contradiction to blockchain in general. It really is. And there's just no way of getting around it. They bump heads all the time. And really traditional KYC is based around the notion that you want to be able to prove that if somebody invested in your company or you're managing their funds, that you know that their money didn't directly come from a terrorist organization or like selling drugs, right? And so there needs to be some type of transactional timeline, paper trail, right? Which is really funny term in this context. But for Bitcoin, early on, that was really, really difficult to do because they didn't understand how the network worked. Like the exchanges didn't have verification processes, stuff like that. And then kind of Coinbase came to the fold and really started requiring a much more stringent policy in terms of being able to open your own account. And that allowed some type of like in for regulators to be like, oh, okay, we can somewhat track this transaction. But even still, we obviously have had an outgrowth of privacy coins, and it's interesting that I've heard a lot of people talk about how privacy coins are going to become more and more popular because realistically, at least the core groups that were motivated to get into the blockchain space to really remove themselves off the grid in that general crypto or cyberpunk mentality is that they want to get away from all that stuff, and they're going to be able to use blockchain as a medium to do that. And so for now, they're just going to focus on the large exchanges. Everyone saw the release of Robinhood in 6 states. Like these large, massive, GDAX is a perfect example. These large, massive exchanges where you can trade a certain type of crypto for another type of crypto. And also, I'll talk about Tether briefly because that's a whole other story. But anyways, so there's a couple different examples, and I think like with the Coinbase user log when they were subpoenaed, that's a really good example. And for the most part, we obviously have seen a lot of hacks of major exchanges, and it's my philosophy that if an exchange hasn't been hacked, the chance of it being hacked has increased on a daily basis. And with that said, I do use a bunch of exchanges, and if anyone wants some recommendations about the best ones, I'll be more than willing to give those. But in terms of kind of the regulation right now, there's no set in stone regulation. So you really have to make sure that they're implementing their own best practices. And this is one of the things I really liked about Bittrex, is that the guys who started Bittrex, they were cybersecurity experts prior to this. And so they got into this industry and created a functioning exchange that really harped itself on its security. And there are so many other examples that just do not do that at all. Liquidity is a perfect example. There's no security. And so it's just like, make sure, that's just kind of my 2 cents, is that you're incorporating some type of due diligence into the exchange. Ask me, ask somebody here. I'm sure there's a lot of experts here. But anyways, in terms of the exchange regulation, moving from the federal to the actual state, we have New York requiring the BIT license. And this very early on, they wanted to address this notion. I think that's because a lot of the exchanges were kind of cropping up. I mean, we had Gemini from the Winklevoss twins. They were based in Manhattan. We had a couple different other exchanges as well. And there was just a big network kind of growing in there. And so the state regulator, he came in and he created this BIT license protocol, and it required you to do AML, KYC, and all of these regulatory compliance mechanisms in order to ensure that you weren't allowing people to trade on your platform who were doing it for fraudulent use, tax evasion, stuff like that. Kind of a separate side note, but I just want to point out for those who aren't aware, but in Wyoming, there's a state Senate bill that's going before the Senate, and it passed the House by a unanimous vote, but it's going to focus in on exempting virtual currencies from property taxation. And so remember when I talked about in the beginning about how when you categorize something as a commodity, there's tax ramifications associated with that. This is a really, really interesting kind of like offshoot of what the federal government is currently doing, and it's very synonymous to legal and medical marijuana in that from the federal perspective it's illegal, but if this bill passes, and it looks like it actually will, that the federal government could essentially come into these individuals and ensure that they're still paying their federal taxes. So by no means, I just want to be very clear, if you move to Wyoming or live in Wyoming, still pay your federal taxes on your cryptos, because it's not going to matter whether they had a bill or legislation in place. It's really not. And then the last thing that I want to talk about was just security. Really harp on cold storage. Get a Trezor, get a Nano. Just, it's worth it. Just make sure, because realistically, like I said before, exchanges get hacked, even the best ones. I mean, it's a nascent industry. Even GDAX could be hacked. Like, we don't know. It could happen. Yeah.
Also have to be careful with the ledgers as well, because on Amazon they're selling them, and they'll send you the predefined key, and if you don't know any better, you just think that's the key, and once you put the key in, they'll actually steal all your funds.
Exactly. Yeah. Just be very careful. Order it directly from the manufacturer. It's actually a really good mentality to have in all crypto contexts, mining, don't buy miners off Amazon. You're just going to get screwed in terms of the cost. Believe me, I've sold them on Amazon. But yeah, so just kind of closing down, but my general perspective about the avenues that they could take in the United States is obviously the nuclear approach, which, as I communicated before, it's unlikely. I don't think they would have communicated the way that they did in the Senate hearings and answer the questions the way that they did if they were really going to come for an outright ban. The limited prohibition approach, I think, is somewhat feasible. So these are just two examples where you come in and you ban the sale of real life goods in exchange for cryptos, or you focus mostly on like the taxation enforcement. And obviously we're seeing the taxation enforcement, and that's pretty unrelated to what the CFTC and SEC does. And as we see Bitcoin futures come into play, stuff like that, we're going to kind of have this much more less limited prohibition approach, which is kind of what it's been for years prior to this. And then there's the stakeholder approach, and I kind of just put this in here just to highlight it. I do always want to try to communicate to anybody who's talking to regulators or is just talking about this in general, is that there is some element of compliance that, at least in the United States, we really rely on third-party independent businesses to do their due diligence, do their own type of or implement their own mechanisms so that they're complying with regulations and stuff like that. And so I think you can kind of have an amalgamation of those two and make sure that there are requirements, but at the same time, they're just making sure that the exchanges are implementing those requirements. And then the last one is just a supporting mechanisms approach. And so it's basically a consensus of users. It's very blockchain-esque. I highly doubt that's going to happen in the US, but you never know, because it could foster illegal and fraudulent use. All right, well, that's pretty much it. Obviously, we'll take any questions anybody has about anything that I've talked about, or it could be outside that context. More than happy to answer. Thanks, guys.